Hello and welcome back. This is pretty cool. I've started this lecture series almost a year ago, about 10 months ago maybe, and I titled it Value of Growth because that's the topic I'm most interested in my research, and launched in. And like many things, it takes me a while to warm up. Really, we get to episode 26 and we start talking about really diving into growth. I've been thinking about growth for a long time, particularly investing in growth and how to value growth. I was very fortunate to be able to co-author a book in 1998 with a guy named Geoff. Geoff is a gem of a guy, but he wrote the most important technology marketing book of all time called Crossing the Chasm. I'll tell a bit of the story with Geoff in this segment, and then I'll tell more of the story with Geoff in the next segment. But meeting Geoff really changed my life, but solidified a bunch of thoughts I had. And his work was instrumental in my understanding how growth works. I've titled this lecture Hypergrowth because, as I said at the end of the last segment, as most people, when they're talking about growth, they're talking about high growth. 5% annual growth is not that interesting to most people. 7, 8, 9 is still probably not that interesting. I think when people think of growth investing, growth stocks, they're really thinking about a growth rate much higher, 15, 20, 25%. I've deemed all of that as hypergrowth, and I'll go through why I think that's a more appropriate term momentarily, but I want to distinguish kind of that higher level of growth, which can't be maintained forever by definition, but can create, under the right conditions, can create enormous shareholder value. And I want to set that up in this segment, and then we'll continue to pursue that in the next few segments as well. All right, so let's jump in to the discussion. All right, for me, when you start thinking about higher growth, I'm going to call that hypergrowth. It always starts with something called the technology adoption life cycle. And this was first articulated by a guy named Everett Rogers in a book he published in 1962 called The Diffusion of Innovations. I'll talk about that book in a minute. But what Everett Rogers did is he took a normal curve. This is a Gaussian distribution, a normal distribution, a bell curve, if you will. We have lots of names for it. And then he just drew one standard deviation. The middle is the mean, the average. And then what Everett did is he drew one standard deviation on each side of the distribution of the mean, and then a second standard deviation. And then he labeled them. He took the standard deviation on the far left and he split that into two components. We'll go through this. Now, whenever I look at this chart, it feels a little bit like there's an optical illusion, because it looks like the standard deviation on the far left is bigger than the standard deviation on the far right. But I drew this chart replicating the chart that Everett Rogers drew, and so I can promise you all the areas are correct. All right, so this is what Everett Rogers did. So he labeled these cohorts there are 5 of them, and he labeled them. First cohort is innovators, that's the far left. The next cohort is early adopters. By the way, he coined that term for those entrepreneurs out there. Then the early majority. Then you get to the halfway point, late majority and laggers. I'll talk about each of these cohorts momentarily. All right, so he just set this up, and he said that this is how technology moves through a population, a society, a community. Starts with innovators, goes to early adopters. You then have early majority, late majority, and then laggers. Laggers are people that tend to adopt the technology late or very slowly. Whereas innovators tend to be very quick to adopt the new technology. And each technology is going to have a different technology adoption life cycle curve, but Everett Rogers said conceptually they all sort of follow this model. All right, so as I said, Everett Rogers publishes his book in 1962. It's actually his dissertation work. This is what is called a meta study, not related to the company, but Rogers didn't do any direct research. He went out and he looked at a bunch of, and I forget the number, he looked at like 1,200 innovation studies looking for patterns. And this is what he came up with. So he looked at all these individual studies to come up with more of a comprehensive or meta study. This book has become incredibly important. In the mid 2000s, it was considered the second most cited book in innovation and sociology, which is pretty amazing. This book had a really big term. As I said, he coined the term early adopters. And Everett Rogers had some personal experience related to technology. His father was a corn farmer, and his father was very quick to adopt mechanical innovations in technology, ones that his father, thought would increase his productivity. But he was very slow and almost reluctant to use any kind of biologics, hybrid seeds, some of the more advanced fertilizers. He didn't believe in that. So Everett Rogers' father was a kind of an early adopter of mechanical and a bit of a laggard when it came to biological chemicals and things. And Everett Rogers he tells the story that story stuck in his mind. And so there was a time when a pesticide came through the cornfields of Iowa and wiped out his father's farm, but not all of the other farms. The other farmers had adopted these hybrid seeds. And that was, I think, a story that really stuck with Everett Rogers. All right, let's walk through some of the cohorts and why they're important. All right, innovators. Innovators pursue new products aggressively, and they often seek out new products before those products are officially launched. And we all know innovators. We know innovators in technology. We know innovators in music. We know innovators in fashion. We know innovators in food, where they really do know the cutting edge of what's going on. And this works for products as well. Now, the key to innovators is they're willing to do all of the work. They seek out the innovations. That's the key. So they're motivated by new. They're motivated by novel. They're motivated by something new. Keep that in mind. It's become really important. All right. Second group is early adopters. These are individuals that buy into new product concepts early in their life cycle, but usually wait until after the product is launched. And early adopters generally are trying to solve a very specific problem, their problem. And so they will put up the slide. They're willing to do some of the work because they're seeking out a solution to their problem. They're not going to work on the general product, but they will work on the product to solve their specific problem. So innovators are really out for novel, new, cutting edge. Whereas early adopters are trying to solve a problem, willing to do some work to solve that problem. That problem is important enough. They're willing to do work. They'll work with a vendor. They'll work with a service provider. They'll work with a new product to get that product or service or consultant, whatever it is, to solve their problem. Once their problem is solved, they're satisfied. All right, early majority buying into new product concepts, but are highly pragmatic and will wait until the product is mature enough to solve real-world problems. So innovators seek out, do all of the work. Early adopters are trying to solve a very specific problem, their problem. The early majority are unwilling to do any work. The product must work as advertised. And in fact, what they want is what a lot of people in technology will call the whole product. They need all of the pieces. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about EVs in a minute. But when you think about an electric vehicle, the whole product is charging stations being a big part of that because people are concerned about range and the ability to charge the product. Other things you'll want, but you need the whole product to be adopted. If you're in the early majority, you need the whole product to work as advertised, which is key. All right, now we take Everett Rogers' normal distribution, it's Gaussian distribution, bell curve. And if you take the area under the curve for the math incline, that's the integral, but it's the area under the curve. For the rest of it, it's the cumulative market. It forms this S-shaped curve, the blue one in the middle of that. And that is essentially represents your adoption. If you're in marketing, we call these S curves. If you're in engineering, it's a logistics curve. If you're in mathematics, it's a sigmoid. All the same thing. Effectively, it is just the area under the cumulative area under the curve or the cumulative market opportunity. I'm going to use this chart instead of the original normal distribution chart because I think it's just easier to see how we create the growth opportunity. All right, so there are your innovators, your early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and the laggards. What's really important to realize is that the early majority can represent between a third and a half of the available market. But they're unwilling to do any work. They need the product to work as advertised. They need the whole product. They need the product to solve their problem. So your innovators are willing to do all of the work. Early adopters are willing to do some of the work, but that early majority are unwilling to do any of the work. And yet, this is the key, they represent 1/3 to 1/2 of the available market. So penetrating the early majority is key to this hypergrowth. That is the key. You've got to get into the early majority. All right, so 1990, this is the first part of my Geoff Moore story. The book gets published in 1991. I think it's the best book on high-tech marketing. Anybody at all around new product innovation should read this book. It is a terrific book, despite being 30-some years old. It is still fantastic. I'm in the process of rereading it. Just really impressed I continue to be impressed by the book, which is the key. And I say it sold more than 800,000. I bet this thing has sold more than 1 million copies, and rightfully so. All right, so this is Geoff Moore's first book that he published. I think it's his first book, certainly his first marketing book, I believe. And this is a key book. And what Geoff says in the book, that's why we call it Crossing the Chasm, is that there is a chasm between the early adopters and the early majority. Remember, the early adopters are trying to solve their specific problem, and they're willing to do work, help contribute work to solve that problem. The problem is so important to them that they're willing to do the work. Early majority is very pragmatic. They are unwilling to do the work. They don't want to do the work. They're focused on other problems. They're running their business, and they need the product or service to work as advertised. They need the whole product. That's the key. And Geoff said, and I think it's just brilliant insight, that because of the different way these two cohorts deal with innovation, there's a chasm between them. Now, if there's a chasm between them, guess what? Penetrating the early innovators and penetrating the early adopters may not help you penetrate the early majority. Now, it can, because you're getting the product done. But you just think about this. The innovators are doing all the work, so they're a terrible reference client for the early adopters, because the early adopters are trying, innovators are driven by novel and new, whereas the early adopters are trying to solve a problem. So they're going to do some of the work. But because both groups are doing work, they are terrible reference for the early majority. And the key is, who are the best references for the early majority? Other early majority adopters. And this becomes the key. So, as you probably have figured out by this point, Geoff talked about crossing the chasm. How do you cross the chasm? How do you go from the early adopters into the early majority? And a lot of companies get fooled by innovators and early adopters. They go to VCs, say, look, we've got all these customers. When in fact, the key is to have early majority customers. That's the business. That's the largest market. You've got to get into that market. And you've got to get into that market if you're going to scale the business at all. All right. So here is just, there's lots of good stuff on the internet. Here's just some other insights into the 5 cohorts. You can kind of take a look at them. So now you need to cross the chasm to get to the early majority. And that is the essence of Geoff's book. He goes on to write another book called Inside the Tornado. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next segment. But this is really Geoff's big insight, is that you have to cross this chasm to get into the early majority. We'll talk a bit about crossing the chasm later in a later segment, but I wanted to set up that this is the key. So hypergrowth to me starts when a company successfully crosses the chasm into the early majority. You could have some interesting growth early on. Innovators and early adopters fuel revenue, and they can help you get the product done for sure. But hypergrowth really starts, for me, once you cross the chasm into the early majority. So we're going to have to talk about a couple of things. How do you cross the chasm? We'll have a little segment on that. Just as a backdrop, those interested should really read Geoff's work. It's outstanding. And then we'll talk about the investment strategy. How do you pick stocks when companies are in the early majority? We're going to get to that in the next couple of segments. I just wanted to set this up. All right, so let me go back through this. The early majority represents 1/3 to 1/2 of the available market. They need the product service to work as advertised. They have no tolerance for incomplete products. They're not going to do any work. They have no interest in experimenting with new products. And by the way, they only trust each other as references. They certainly don't trust innovators or early adopters because those two cohorts have a very different motivation, very different tolerance for incomplete products. So big takeaway is early majority is 1/3 to 1/2 of the available market. They are no nonsense, and they only reference each other. And Geoff really does an amazing job of talking about getting early reference clients, early reference customers in the early majority and using that flywheel. We'll talk a bit about that as well. All right, so now the challenge is to know when the company product has gained foothold in the early majority. So here's the homework quiz. Have EVs entered the early majority? EVs being electric vehicles. There's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of pushback now, which I think is incredibly ironic. That for a nation that loves innovation, we're going to suppress the most important innovation in transportation. But hey, we'll probably survive this as well. All right, so back to the homework question. Have electronic vehicles crossed the chasm? I'll give you my answer in the next segment if you want to leave a comment as to your vote. But that to me is really cool. All right, so the focus of hypergrowth is the early majority, and the first stage is crossing the chasm. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the rest of my interaction with Geoff more. As I said, he had a profound impact on me. Not only did we ultimately write a book together, but I really learned a lot reading his stuff and talking to him. All right. And then once you cross the chasm, you get into the early majority. And once they gain a foothold in the early majority, you go into hypergrowth. So there's my visual for hypergrowth. All right. I think that's the last slide. Yes. All right. So that's where we're headed. Next couple of segments, we'll talk about crossing the chasm. We'll talk about the investment implications of getting into the early majority and entering hypergrowth. All right. Thank you.